If we've got everybody filing into the room, can I say welcome? Yes, marvellous. Hello, everybody, and welcome again on this blustery night to Scotland's Climate Festival online. Just to introduce myself, my name is Rachel Cooper and I'll be chairing this evening's event. I'm currently the Programme Director for Children's Neighbourhoods Scotland, a programme hosted and delivered by the University of Glasgow that's focused really on the voice of children and young people and supporting increasing their well-being. However, more importantly, I'm also a trustee of Keep Scotland Beautiful, and I am privileged to be able to chair this event with that hat on for you all tonight. I would very much like to thank our funder for the event, Scottish Government, who have been supporting Scotland's Climate Festival. And as noted, this is the second event this week, with the earlier one seeing lively debate and discussion and welcome support from 5 national partners at that event. However, it's not just national partners we're talking about here. Alongside this national series, there is Scotland's Climate Festival is available there to support communities across the country. So if local community groups have local festivals they're thinking of running, and they would like to register and gain access to expert guidance or support, as well as seed funding to get their events up and running, then there will be a website that will be shared with you in the chat function at keepscotlandbeautiful.org that you can certainly look into for additional information. So tonight's event is basically here to host and look at this one question that was posed to you all, which was the wellbeing economy, the creating thriving communities in a changing climate. And we have 4 great speakers lined up for you tonight. We have 3 of them who will be with us later for the panel discussion. But as was lined before, we have 1 starter for 10, as it were, which is the Minister, Lorna Slater, who's come to join us this evening. So Lorna, as many of you know, is the Minister for Green Skills, Circular Economy and Biodiversity, and was elected in August 2021. And Lorna, as you will probably tell you, was born and raised in Canada as an engineer by passion, not just by trade, I believe. I think it's safe to say. So without going no further ado, I will let Lorna introduce herself, and thank you very much for taking the time out again on this blustery evening to join us and speak to this topic. So without further ado, may I hand over to yourself, Lorna.
Brilliant, thank you very much, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here on this blustery evening instead of out in the weather. I feel badly for anyone who needs to be out tonight. So I was elected in May to the Scottish Parliament and then appointed as a minister at the end of August last year. And it has been a steep learning curve, but we're on the job. It's very exciting what's happening in my portfolio, which, as Rachel correctly said, is green skills, circular economy and biodiversity, all really key things to transform the economy of Scotland and move it toward the wellbeing economy, which is, I know, what we're all here for. So again, thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to join you here tonight at this Scotland's Climate Festival event. All of us here understand the need for urgent transformative action to tackle the global crises of climate change and ecological decline. A change of direction is vital to preserve life on Earth. Saving the world isn't optional. Scotland was one of the first countries in the world to declare a global climate emergency, and we have world-leading targets to end our contribution to climate change by 2045. Our ambitious interim 2030 target of a 75% reduction in emissions is the most ambitious legally binding commitment for this next decade that we are aware of for any country in the world. As a nation, we need to rise to this challenge and advance towards net zero emissions by building on the actions that we've already taken, including things like the ScotWind programme, which will provide us enough power for every home in Scotland, as well as placing Scotland at the forefront of the green hydrogen revolution and allowing us to become a major exporter of clean energy. The Housing to 2040 and heat and building strategies, which will work together to deliver our statutory targets for climate change and fuel poverty. At the heart of all of our efforts will be a defining mission for a just transition, leaving no person or industry or community behind. The Scottish Government has a transformational vision for Scotland's future. We want to create a greener, fairer Scotland built on a well-being economy, with a society that is thriving and prosperous. At COP26, Scotland, along with all other members of the Wellbeing Economy Government Alliance, made a joint pledge to continue collaboration and efforts to make the transition to a wellbeing economy, and for this to be entwined with action to address the global climate emergency. The Scottish Government is taking action to deliver on this pledge by putting people and planet at the heart of our vision for a wellbeing economy. Well-being is about our quality of life as individuals, in communities, and it encompasses our personal and collective well-being, as well as that of other species and the natural environment upon which we all depend to support life. We don't exist to serve the economy. The economy is how we get what we need and how we support each other within the boundaries of our planet's ecosystem. The COVID-19 pandemic has further emphasized the interconnected nature of social well-being, economic prosperity, and environmental sustainability. In building a well-being economy, what we measure matters. As part of the Butte House Agreement, which is the grown-up name of the cooperation deal between the Greens and the Scottish Government, we agreed to develop a well-being economy monitor, a dashboard, a bit like what New Zealand has, which I know we'll be hearing about later on, which will look beyond GDP to measure things that people really value: the quality of jobs, the health of our citizens, and the impact of economic activity on our environment. This will be used to measure our progress and influence our decision-making. I can assure you that as a member of this government, I will be looking at these measures closely as we set them up and as we use them in decision-making going forward. Scotland has strong foundations on which to build a well-being economy, with a skilled population, a proven track record in areas like innovation, and our large resource of renewable energy. To gather more data, we are working in partnership with Clackmannanshire Council to carry out the Wellbeing Economy Pilot Project. This work will inform the publication of the Wellbeing Economy Framework, which will support local authorities, policymakers, and delivery partners across Scotland to understand and apply wellbeing economy principles in their local area. The Butte House Agreement calls for many measures to implement a wellbeing economy, including a focus on living wages, fair work, and collective bargaining. We all saw during the pandemic how crucial essential workers are to us getting our food and medicine and other necessities. So the focus will be on ensuring that everyone who works benefits. And if we want to change who benefits, we need to change who owns our businesses and for whose benefit they are run. As stated in the Butte House Agreement, we will set out how we will provide tailored support for businesses with alternative ownership models, including cooperatives and social enterprises, with a view to increasing their representation in the Scottish economy. We know how cooperatives, social enterprises, and community-owned businesses enhance their communities and have excellent track records in fair pay and positive environmental impacts. We want the benefits of hard work and entrepreneurship to be enjoyed by the people doing the work and for the profits to stay within communities. The well-being of our communities, the ability of children to play outdoors or people to enjoy beaches and parks is blighted by litter and waste. We will address this by bringing forward a circular economy bill to encourage reuse, repair, and improve our recycling around Scotland. That will be consulted on very soon. This bill will aim to reduce waste, which in turn reduces our carbon footprint, but also will make our public spaces cleaner and safer and reduce pressure on local councils to have to clean things up. You don't have to clean it up if it doesn't get wasted in the first place. Part of this work has been to establish a sharing library and reuse cafe support network. Repair and reuse are really key to waste prevention. Think about what you could repair or reuse or donate for another to reuse before you throw it away. There are already 24 repair, cafe, and sharing library projects in operation across Scotland, and our funding aims to increase this number to 100 over the next 3 years. And finally, living in a country with a healthy natural environment is vital to all of our well-being. Something that I'm particularly excited about is the establishment of our Nature Restoration Fund. £65 million will work across Scotland, creating new green jobs, reinvigorating local communities, and delivering transformative change to drive forward that nature recovery. New locally driven projects to improve ecological connectivity, deliver long-term restoration of nature, which benefits biodiversity and helps us address the climate emergency. Tackling the climate crisis requires all of us at every level to get involved. we can all make a difference. We can build the world that we want to see. We have until 2030 to significantly cut our emissions and meet our statutory climate change targets. We must begin a process of rapid change across our economy if we're to achieve these ambitions. We must take this opportunity to deliver a well-being economy, with equality, sustainability, prosperity, and resilience at its core. We recognize that by putting communities in charge of their own destinies, this is central to their well-being. We are committed to working with people and communities across Scotland to deliver on our commitment and to help us realize our vision for a well-being economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorna. That's greatly appreciated, your time and passion there at this moment in time. Now, what I forgot to say at the beginning, but I will reiterate now, is if you have questions for Lorna, please do put them in the Q&A and we will bring them forward to Lorna. But perhaps as a starter for 10, if that's possible, Lorna, may I take chair's prerogative and ask a question of you? But can we better connect communities in urban and rural areas through a well-being? And what can we do to ensure that the benefits that a well-being economy can bring aren't necessarily urban or city centre focused?
I mean, it's such a broad topic, isn't it, the well-being economy? And I think we would measure these things differently in different areas. Of course, the sort of challenges that we find in rural areas are things around cost of housing, availability of housing. We have this enormous potential in Scotland for these sort of green jobs on the land, nature restoration, deer management, crofting, regenerative farming. There's huge potential in all of these areas, but actually we have trouble getting people to work because there's a lack of housing. So there are fantastic jobs going in forestry and other careers on the land, in land management, in all the science that goes around that. But if people don't have housing, then how can they take advantage of these opportunities? So it's all about this kind of joined up thinking, okay, we need to boost the rural economy. These jobs exist, these opportunities exist. That means we need the housing. It means we need the public transportation. All of those things will contribute to the well-being of the rural economy. You know, urban economies have different challenges. So it isn't about having a one-size-fits-all approach. These projects where we're investing in them are generally community-driven, so that people can influence what is happening around them, and hopefully projects will succeed in doing that. You know, depending on you know, how well things go, that is certainly the intention, that people will, you know, have more of a say in what happens around them.
So perhaps to follow on to that, then there's a query that's come through about maybe a bit more detail about the pilot project in Clackmannan, because obviously Clackmannanshire as a county is sort of that hybrid model. So it's not quite urban, but it's not quite fully rural. So maybe there could be some learning from that. So maybe if you could tell us a bit more about that.
I'm afraid I actually can't. I don't know very much about it at all. It isn't something that's sort of being covered in my portfolio. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you on that one, but I'm happy to go and look it up and get back to you. The main thing that what I do know about it is that it's about collecting this data that we need. So we want to put together this dashboard of well-being economy, well-being monitors, but they need to matter for Scotland. They need to be ones that really will be useful going forward, because it's you want to measure the right thing. You don't want to have unintended consequences and measure the wrong thing. So the point of doing a pilot is to see how we use well-being economy measures in our decision making and see what effects those have. We kind of need to collect all the baseline data as well. So my understanding, what little I have, is that is part of the point of that project. But no, I'm afraid I don't have any more information about that. I would like to learn more about it as well.
No worries. There is on the chat function somebody offering to provide more information about that to us all. So that's very handy to have people online who can do that for us there at this moment in time. There is some other questions that are just coming through, so forgive me for scrolling at this moment in time. But in regard to something you did mention, I think we'll come on to this later. This idea of ambition for a well-being economy, I think there's something in there. You were talking about the measures and the measures and the metrics for it. And you mentioned something about them possibly needing to flex by location. Is there something more you would like to discuss there about how we're looking to progress towards understanding if we're working towards and achieving the goal of a well-being economy?
I mean, that's the stage we're at, is at that early stage, is figuring out what the right metrics are. Because, you know, what what's true in one part of the country may not be true in another. So we need to make sure we do have the right set. I don't have in front of me the sort of set of metrics that we're going to use, because that is currently under development. That pilot project will help us with that. But it's the kind of thing that I'm interested in hearing about. So, I mean, if you have ideas or have a study that you've come across where people have been doing work in this area, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Dr. Morrissey and their experience in New Zealand for what they've done with metrics and so on. But this is new for us here in Scotland. We'll be putting this in place and learning about it as we go. So we need to get the right metrics in place. I don't know what that looks like, but I'm interested in hearing your thoughts.
No, I mean, I think there'll be plenty of people out there listening who probably have thoughts, and I'm sure we'll get stuff firing through. But there was one query that's just come through, and a query about sort of what is the relationship going to be then really between the National Performance Framework and potentially the new Wellbeing Dashboard. What's the read-through going to look like, and how's that going to be developed?
Well, I would very much hope as a member of the government that when we're making future decisions, so you probably know that this National Strategy for Economic Transformation is due. And based on the Butte House Agreement, we know that we're going to be putting in place this dashboard of well-being measures, which we can then use. So the first thing we need is to understand the data and to have that baseline to understand what measures we're working forward. And then we can make decisions around moving those forward. And there is a definite commitment within this government to move to a well-being economy. So because we're at the early stages of that, it's hard to see exactly how those are going to feed through just at this point, because what we need to do is set those up so that we can then go, okay, well, here, in order to improve this metric, these are the decisions that we're going to make. But certainly as a member of the government, I will absolutely be committed to looking at those indicators and making them influence my decision making so that we make sure we are building the right kind of economy that we want for Scotland.
No, that's thank you very much for that. And forgive my glazing backwards and forwards because the questions are coming in, so I'm just scanning down them at this moment in time. There's a question that's coming in. It goes, can we move beyond departmental silos to implement holistically the wellbeing economy? So that's not a bigger question at all. But I think what we're talking about there is there's a recognition that not just in government, but in other structures, there is a tendency to have silo operation. And this requires the bigger questions, the bigger thinking. So does government recognize this, and are there moves towards implementing such a new way of thinking to go alongside this?
Well, I think you can see it already, particularly in my appointment and the appointment of my colleague Patrick Harvey. You can hear my portfolio sounds a bit odd: green skills, circular environment, and biodiversity. But all of these things are very broad areas, and the point is that they touch on portfolios of other ministers, and they touch on so many aspects of our lives. Things like the circular economy alone not only do things like improve our well-being by reduce waste and by reducing litter in our streets, they also create jobs opportunities in terms of recycling centers, designing new materials and setting up opportunities. And they also have everything to do with reducing our carbon footprint. So all of these things are very broad reaching. So you can see that as evidence of this joined up thinking within government. As we all know here, many of the things that improve a well-being economy also look to reducing our carbon footprint. So the big one is the heat in homes. That's enormous in terms of reducing our national carbon footprint, as well as improving people's lives, making it more affordable for people to heat their homes, fewer people suffering from damp and cold or fuel poverty. So, doing so, upgrading our homes in Scotland will be creating tens of thousands of jobs. And then the supply chain that goes along with that, the people who make the heat pumps and drive, ship them around the country and install them and so on. So these are huge opportunities. And we can think of the well-being economy very broadly as improving people's lives. And I think we could all have measures around that are quite qualitative in terms of safety in our town centers, the quality of the air we breathe, or we can think about it in a really quantitative sense in terms of average salaries, in terms of the life expectancy and that sort of thing. So I think when we have this dashboard, we need a mixture of those things to really describe our experiences, and the experiences of, as you alluded to in earlier questions, of people across Scotland. Someone like myself who lives in a city centre, I already live in a 20-minute neighbourhood, so that element of my quality of life is good. But things like air quality and noise quality are very poor where I am because of heavy traffic, which wouldn't happen, that would be the exact opposite problems of someone in a rural area. So it's a really interesting part of the discussion, but I think we do recognize that joined up thinking is needed. It doesn't mean it's easy to do, but we do recognize it and we are making progress with it.
No, and I think that's a fair point. Anything that's easy to do will have already been done. It's always the hard stuff that's left. There was something you referred to there about green skills and something you mentioned earlier, I'd just like to bring together, which was about rural economy and looking at the green skills marketplace and looking at younger people in this market. So we all know where we are in the world. We have a climate emergency. The children have been very vocal from our schools and education settings about it. But the world they're going to inherit is going to be very different from the ones we inherited. So in terms of skills for the future, green skills to the future, what is it we can look at and hope for within government's ambition for a wellbeing economy that might look to support that agenda or address that agenda?
Well, I can share with you my personal vision for green skills in Scotland. Now, green skills is very broad, or can be very broad, because in the future, all jobs will be green jobs, because everybody's workplace will be net zero and everybody's workplace will be much more conscious of these things. But for the moment, I think of green jobs or green skills in three different categories. One is the sort of construction category, which is building stuff like upgrading houses, building wind turbines, tidal turbines, all that kind of building heat pumps, that sort of construction and manufacturing piece. The second piece I think of as land-based or sea-based skills. So that's your forestry, your regenerative farming, your land management, things like blue carbon sequestration or aquaculture, that kind of thing. Huge opportunities in all of those areas. And the final area is in the circular economy. So that's everything from designing products to be more easily recycled, designing products for repair, to actually doing the repairs, doing the recycling, building the recycling plants, and so on. So there's enormous opportunities in each of these three areas. And as I said earlier, actually, the problem is a labor shortages in those areas, getting the people to the right areas. So I see it in my mind of three streams of people that we need to help into these really fantastic opportunities. And that is young people coming up the way. It is people who've taken a career gap and are returning to the workplace, and people who are exiting high carbon industries. So there's these kind of flows of people who have different needs, possibly are different ages, different stages in their careers, who have these different requirements. And then we have these pools of opportunity. And so we need to create these flows which allow people who maybe been working a desk job in the oil and gas industry to go, do you know what? I want to learn how to be a forester. I really fancy working on the land for the next few years of my career. Or encouraging young people that there are really fantastic opportunities out there that they can take up that, maybe for whatever reason they normally don't get a chance to hear about. So that's what I'll be working on, is working on those quite specific framework with those areas. But green skills could be thought of as a lot more broad than that as well. Things like even driving a hydrogen-powered bus or hydrogen-powered train is definitely going to be a green skill, that kind of thing. So you can think about it quite broadly.
Okay, there's a follow-on question that's almost an addendum to that when we talk about green skills, and we work in a variety of mixed neighbourhoods that we all exist in. How can we work to ensure that those people in the lowest income, in those communities that possibly most disadvantaged, get to be aware of what opportunities are out there and get the opportunity to develop the skills through the education system to take up those opportunities? So to that end, obviously, with green skills as under your belt, does that mean you then sit in the inter-ministerial group on policy coherence at this moment in time?
I don't sit on that particular group, but I do work closely with other ministers in the overlapping portfolios, because with green skills, you can imagine that overlaps with colleges, it overlaps with the just transition agenda, it overlaps with the industrial agenda. So I work with other ministers quite closely on this. I mean, what you describe are the challenges in terms of getting the information to people that these jobs are there, pointing them at the training, pointing them at the resources or grants that are available, and making sure that people have those opportunities. That is exactly the challenge in front of us. And things like the Green Jobs Workforce Academy are tools. I'm not saying that's the right tool for everybody, but those are tools that people can use that we're starting to make available and starting to develop, where people can come to it and say, I'm really interested in a job in this area. How do I get from where I am now to where I need to be? I mean, the young people coming up through the education system and into colleges is in some ways the most direct and obvious route, but that means that the people giving the young people advice need to know those opportunities are available too, and what the pathways are. So it's definitely a big goal, because as a country, we need to reshape our economy, and skills and labor is such a huge part of that. We have to reskill and upskill huge proportions of our workforce over the next 10 years to take on these opportunities. And they are good opportunities, they're well-paid jobs. But yeah, that is the challenge at hand, and we're just starting to grapple with how we're going to do that.
Very good. Well, I know we're running short of time, so I've probably got one last question for you, which I'm picking up from the audience here. And it's probably a good summation one at the end, and you might well have answered some of it, but hopefully it'll help. But what do you see as the greatest hurdles now in actually implementing this? And how do you hope that these will be overcome? So possibly more a step by step from the levers that you can use in your role.
I mean, I think you've outlined some of the issues there. I think part of it is that it is so broad that we need to, as a government, focus on priorities that are really key and make sure to deliver on those. You know, in limited resources in a fixed amount of time, one cannot do everything that one would wish to do as quickly as one would like to. One needs to prioritize the really important things. I think the homes and building strategy is going to be so important, as I said before. That's crucial for hitting our climate targets. It's crucial for tackling fuel poverty and making sure that people are able to heat their homes going forward. And it will be a massive creation of jobs and important for our supply chain and manufacturing too. So that's a really big one. A lot of the other ones are around living wages, the creation of a national care service. All of these things are both about making sure the people doing the work are getting fair pay, and that a national care service, something we desperately need, make sure that people are experiencing care, have a much better time of it in terms of their outcomes and standardization of care and so on. So those kind of very broad projects are key ones to tackling all three of these issues in Scotland. And it's about delivering on those and following through with them. And I know this government is committed to both of those things.
No, I mean, I think you might not have seen, but there's plenty of conversation in the chat, and there are people offering to share information and update on each other. And I think that's been a wonderful starter for 10. I know your time is precious tonight, so thank you very much for your support, supporting Keep Scotland Beautiful, supporting Keep Scotland's Climate Festival tonight. It is greatly appreciated. I'm sure the debate will continue, and we hope to follow up with you with relation to some of the things that might have come out from all this. But if I may say thank you on behalf of Keep Scotland Beautiful and the audience here for your time tonight, and thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
And I think you can see some comments there. So Lorna was but one of four speakers we have tonight for everybody who's joined us. And what we'll go on to now is I'll actually introduce our next three speakers. We will have opportunity for each of them just to give you an update on who they are and what they're doing. And then certainly we'll go into sort of a moderated discussion. But again, I urge you, if there's questions coming to mind, please do put them in the Q&A and we'll try and feed them through into the discussion tonight. So of our three speakers, we have Dr. Lucas Hart, Dr. Susie Morrissey, and Lewis Ryder-Jones coming to join us tonight. Dr. Lucas Hart, if I can ask you to come on screen first. He's our Policy and Engagement Lead from WEGo in Scotland. We have Dr. Susan Morrissey, who's our Research Associate from the Public Policy Institute at the University of Auckland and co-founder of WEGo out in Aotearoa, New Zealand hub. And we have Lewis Ryder-Jones, Deputy Chief Executive Officer of Scotland's International Development Alliance and Chair of the SDG Network here in Scotland. So quite an esteemed alumni in front of me. But maybe if I can ask Lucas, if you could maybe just give the audience a quick update on who you are, what your role is, please.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here tonight for this panel discussion. And yeah, so I work for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, specifically the Scotland hub, or WEAll, as we call the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, because that word will probably come up quite a few times tonight. And the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is really a kind of global collaboration between lots of people who have a vision of transforming our economy towards one that delivers social justice on a healthy planet. And that collaboration was born really out of the realization that many of you might share, is that if we want to achieve our really ambitious climate targets that we need to achieve globally and in Scotland to avoid the worst damages of climate change, we really need to transform our economy, in the sense that a lot of the current damage of climate change, but also a lot of the social problems we're having, is really a result of the way our economy is designed and the way it's focused on growth at pretty much any cost, and and in the way that it is focused on for businesses on generating profits above other, and in the way that it doesn't kind of allow for a lot of other ways to function. And yeah, and so I think this topic for tonight is really interesting, because I used to work, I've always been very interested in climate change for a long time, and I used to be involved in a community level in a transition initiative when I did my undergraduate degree on the kind of community climate action level. And on one level, that has been obviously really rewarding, working in an initiative like that, but it's also it's been frustrating at times, and it's really shown me the need, why we need this wider system level change. Like, I don't know, we had projects where we were really hard trying to get people to cycle, but then at the same time, every second TV advert that you see is telling people to buy cars. So I think what I would like to talk about today, and which would be quite interesting, is really about how we can change the systems at different levels. Like, how can we make sure that communities, we can create the kind of well-being economy at the community level, and what are the wider changes needed to enable that on the national level and at the global level. And so the well-being economy as a whole is Alliance, which I'm working for now, works at the global level, and it's really about bringing together all the people who are already passionate about it, who share the values, who are already doing amazing projects, amazing thinking, and bringing them together to actually establish a power base that can actually achieve some change, and to also tell a different story around what our economy is for and what we want to do. And as a part of this now, we have more and more kind of individual hubs bubbling up all over the world. So Scotland is quite is one of them. New Zealand is another one, and Susie's going to talk about that in a little bit. But also we have now hubs coming up in Canada, in California, and in lots of other places. And yeah, so I'm really excited. I think I probably better stop there. Really excited to talk to the others and hear your questions as well.
Thank you, Lucas, very much for that introduction. If I may hand over to Dr. Susie Morrissey. And for those who aren't aware, good morning, Susie.
Good morning, everyone. Kia ora koutou. So yeah, I'm from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I have set up the Wellbeing Alliance Hub, as Lucas referred to, in New Zealand, along with a couple of colleagues. So I am a public servant during the day, and I was involved in WEGo, which is the government arm of the Wellbeing Alliance Network, Wellbeing Economy Alliance, excuse me. And that's where I got involved. And then when I ceased doing that job, I still wanted to be involved with this movement, because obviously I can see how important it is, and I really wanted to stay part of it. So as a public servant, my entry into wellbeing work was the wellbeing budgets that we introduced in New Zealand that you might have heard about. So our first one was in 2019. We've had a few now. And those wellbeing budgets have really shown a move towards prioritising people and the planet over simply the increase in GDP. Now, in recent times, the most obvious example of that in terms of prioritising people is probably the decision that the government took in early 2020 to close our borders once the COVID pandemic started. So that's been really tough in terms of we've been stuck here in our beautiful island and we haven't been able to leave, and our whānau, our family overseas, haven't been able to come in. So it's been a really tough experience, but what that's done, excuse me, is it's protected our people, and we've had very, very few COVID outbreak cases here and very, very few deaths. So we've been very fortunate. So that's just one example of, obviously our GDP has been negatively impacted by that decision, but the well-being of our people has of course increased because many of us have not been sick and we have had a few fatalities. So that's one thing that we've done. And then the other thing, to think about what the minister was saying, is we've had some reporting that we've put into place, some legislation, so that we've got different aspects of reporting that has to occur. For example, environmental reporting, which occurs every 6 months, and child poverty reporting, because unfortunately that's a problem for us here, which we do annually now as part of the budget, and that's been put into legislation that there must be a child poverty report as part of the wellbeing budget. I could talk about a number of different aspects, and we'll see where the chat goes. But I will just say that as part of the wellbeing budgets, they are based on information from our living standards framework. So a multi-faceted, multi-domain approach to measuring wellbeing, which we've set up here. And I'm happy to talk about that. It takes a very much a national approach, uses national data. So a little bit different from some of that regional sensitivity that we heard the Minister talk about. But I think that's a great approach for Scotland. And so I'm happy to talk about that if that's of interest. But yeah, that's a little intro to wellbeing in New Zealand.
That's appreciated, Susie. Thank you very much for that, and some interesting stuff that's already spurred off questions in my head. Third panelist tonight, not least at all, Lewis, I wonder if you could possibly just give us a quick introduction to yourself and the areas you're interested in.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for having me, and so interesting to hear from the others already. I feel perhaps they have more to offer to this conversation than I do. I was asked here this evening because I wear two hats. So I am the Deputy Chief Executive of Scotland's International Development Alliance, which is a membership body in Scotland for all types of people and organisations who support and work on issues related to global sustainable development. So that is a collection of all the kind of household NGOs that work internationally, but also a range of public sector actors, individuals and private enterprises. Our membership's around 200 or so organizations. So that's my day job. I also work for, in a voluntary capacity, for the SDG Network Scotland, which was set up in 2017 with national lottery funding and housed by the SCVO until last year. It's now run independently with a steering group, of which I'm the chair, and received some coordination support from Keep Scotland Beautiful, which is the connection to me today. That network is open and remains so. I encourage all of you to join here tonight. We have around about 700 members at this stage, having grown from around 10 of us in a room back in 2017. So we've really grown. I'm not here to talk about the SDGs, although they are completely interrelated to this conversation, and we can maybe come back to the imperfect nature of that framework for achieving well-being later. And it links very closely to one of the main flaws within Scotland's own framework for prosperity, the MPF, which is obviously a focus on growth and GDP, but we can come back to that. I think I've been asked tonight because I focus on well-being from a global development and global justice perspective. So really, I'm here to talk about what a well-being economy means in that context. And I suppose I start with a really important question that I ask myself is, whose well-being matters most? And I think the answer to that depends on how you define well-being, as we've already heard this evening from Lorna and others and Lucas a few moments ago. But I think it's a complicated truth is that actually it's quite simple. It's that our own well-being matters just as much as our children's and people elsewhere in countries both near and far. And that equality and importance that we believe should be put onto well-being is a conundrum. One approach that you can use to define well-being is related to, it being a fundamental human need being met, which just simply isn't happening in many countries and regions of the world, least of all some of Scotland's own partner countries in its international development programme. In this sense, for me, a well-being economy shouldn't start, and in fact cannot start nor end with national borders. It demands that we put global justice firmly on the agenda and that we do all that we can here in Scotland to ensure that everyone, wherever they are in the world, can thrive now and into the future. So for us at the Alliance, so Scotland's International Development Alliance, it's a bit of a mouthy name, so we call ourselves the Alliance. We think that broader definition understanding is inextricably linked to how we define sustainable development as a concept. For us, that is about societal development everywhere that allows humanity to survive and thrive into the long term. And for to be sustainable, for development to be sustainable, it must respect and protect the environment while delivering fairness and justice. And that's very much the principles of the wellbeing economy as laid out by Lucas. So we kind of come at this from a global perspective, as others within the well-being economy community do clearly, and that's more important than ever. From a Scottish perspective, we cannot, if we ever could, separate the nature crisis and climate emergency here from our own consumption habits and fossil fuel dependency, also our waste management and exportation. And we can't decouple our own economic prosperity from the poverty experienced elsewhere either. So how do we ensure that that global well-being economy is approached through a global lens? Well, it's not easy, and we think it does require systems change. So I'm glad Lucas mentioned that, and that requires system change on a lot of different levels. Public policy is, in any nation, and Susie just pointed this out in New Zealand's approach to COVID and closing its borders, it is necessarily self-interested in the context of global capitalism, also in the context of a global pandemic. But it also has to be the very opposite of that, as we know, as we see vaccine inequality roll out across the world. So we have to find ways to ensure that we can plan, act, and evaluate in ways to force ourselves and to think beyond whatever our local is in order to really achieve that vision. So in the Scottish context, we think there is a really good way of doing that through legislation. It's legislation that has been committed to by the Scottish Government around wellbeing and sustainable development. Other such pieces of legislation going through Parliament that Lorna mentioned earlier are really important, but we need things to link them all together to really break down those silos. So taking inspiration from the successes and limitations of similar pieces of legislation in the UK, namely the Future Generations Act in Wales, we pushed for this ahead of last year's election. We have seen the Scottish Government commit that they will do this. They've said that they will do it to put duties on public bodies and local government to take account of their impact of the decisions on sustainable development in Scotland and internationally. We've been doing some research, which is soon to be published within the next few weeks, around what this might look like in practice. But ultimately, it's about framing our approach to well-being that recognizes that these current systems, namely economic systems, do not meet the needs of people nor the planet when we see it through that global lens. And we need a whole of government approach that maximizes that commitment to well-being and global responsibility. So I'm more than happy to talk about a bit more detail about what we're thinking around that legislation and how that links to the wider conversation on the well-being. So I'll stop there. So thank you for having me and looking forward to the chat.
No, thank you very much, Lewis. That's appreciated. And I have just been informed that Lorna Slater is actually available to stay with us for this element here and engage in some of the conversation that's about to take place. So there have been questions coming through, but actually I'm going to throw it back to all four of you actually now, all four of you in some respects, because conversely, listening to what you've all said, there's an element where well-being starts with an individual and self, and that was recognized that there is an element of personal well-being, but we have to straddle this right through both personal feelings of well-being, community feelings of well-being, regional, national, and international. And at every stage, there are ramifications that are contradictory to the other section of society or grouping that we're looking at. So how can we change systems? What can we do to change systems that make it acceptable for every element of society to progress towards a well-being economy? Bearing in mind, when Susie spoke, that in pursuing a well-being approach, there has been an impact on GDP. So the question then comes down to, what will we look to measure and how will we persuade those in our society that going beyond GDP is a good thing, to look at both well-being and climate when going beyond GDP might have personal individual influence? And I don't know who wants to go off for that meaty question first. Susie, you've stuck your hand up.
I'm happy to just make an opening comment, but I'm sure the others have got some things to add. That I think one of the ways of looking at this is an intergenerational perspective. And so if you're able to be thinking about what we're doing now and what the impacts will be, on our family in the future, and our planet in the future, then I think that's one of the, the key ways that we're able to start a broader conversation that helps to move away from that level of individualism that is also the here and now, and allows us to start thinking about longer term issues, which are always really hard, including for our friends in politics, particularly hard for them. But when we're able to start thinking in a longer term about all of the implications that our actions are having, I think that's one way of kind of opening up that conversation. So I just offer intergenerational perspective as a starting point.
Apologies, there was a moment there. In relation to that, Lorna, you've put your hand up. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to come into that. I think I'm sort of happy to answer this more as co-leader of the Scottish Green Party than as a government minister, because the use of GDP as a measure of economic success is an excluded item in the View House Agreement, because we know that the Scottish Greens have a different view on that matter. So I'm very much speaking as co-leader of the Scottish Green Party at the moment. I think that this is all part of a conversation we need to have about what an economy looks like. What are we moving into? Because the existing conversations about economy, I'm sure you all know, if I'm an economics nerd about these things, we exist in something that economics nerds like myself call the Neoliberal Consensus. Everybody in the world, just about in a position of power, thinks that there is only one way to run an economy, and that the only way to measure success in that economy is a GDP. Essentially, that's it. And you can add a little bit more of a welfare state or a little bit less of a welfare state, but ultimately what you really need is growth, 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 growth. That's it. That's the story that everybody tells. Now, the green parties around the world, and the Scottish Green Party in particular, don't think that model works. For one, it's destroying our biosphere. If you thought living through a pandemic was bad, you haven't tried to live through the breakdown of your planet's biosphere yet. And that means we have to have a different kind of economy. Now, over the last 100 years, during the 20th century, there were different experiments that happened with different economies, often under totalitarian regimes. So when you have that combination of a totalitarian regime and a sort of extreme experiment with your economy, had some, let's say, mixed results in the 20th century. But those are the only stories we have to tell. And so you say things like, oh, well, we need an economy that's more balanced, about prosperity, that doesn't involve growth. And everyone immediately goes, you're trying to make us like North Korea. It's like, oh, God. It's very frustrating. We almost don't even have the language anymore to talk about changes to an economy, because we're all the Western economies are so into this narrow space. So this is something we're just starting to talk about. How do you have a successful economy, and how do you measure that success that is different than the neoliberal model? And we talk about, even the media discourse is very locked into right-wing economics or left-wing economics, as if sort of your dad's 70s socialism is the only other model, and that isn't true. So we're trying to develop new models, and the people on this call, I absolutely know about Catherine Trebek's work, know about Kate Raworth's work, the donut economy. We're all talking about the well-being economy, but we're kind of moving our way forward into what that is. I think because of the nature of the climate emergency and the urgency of it, that does mean more state intervention. That is what that means. More state intervention means you need to make sure that the money is going there, which probably does mean more taxation. Again, this is not me speaking as a minister. This is very much me with my party hat on. That's what I think that looks like, because I think you want the power and decision making in your economy to be done by democratic means. And that means as close to the people to whom that decision matters as possible. And that is absolutely the philosophy of the Scottish Green Party. And so things that the Scottish Greens will be canvassing for, in future elections and campaigning on, things like smaller local authorities, so that you have a better chance of knowing who the people are who are spending your tax pounds, and knowing what they're spending it on is going to really matter to you. So the decisions are happening that you participate in, and then instead of happening to you from a distance. So that's all about improving your democracy. But like, none of us know what this looks like. We have inklings of what it might look like. I think the Scandinavian countries are doing quite well. We think New Zealand's doing quite well. We're all learning together as we move forward into this future. But nobody's done this work before. So you can't point at another country and go, oh, well, they've got it nailed, we're just going to do it like that. We're all kind of moving forward together. And there is a lot of nervousness because of this sort of global consensus that neoliberal capitalism is the only way to run an economy. So yeah, it's a challenging and exciting time for us to be here. But challenging global norms is not an easy thing to do.
No, I do appreciate that. To that end, maybe if I can bring in Lucas again, your thoughts in relation to your experiences through WEGo, in relation to addressing this hefty, broad topic at this moment.
I think probably to say it's not that much of a debate, because I very much agree with what the Lorna and Susie have already said. I think what's really important for me is the fundamental hope and of the well-being economy is that by moving to a well-being economy, you can actually make everyone better off in the terms that actually matters for people, like whatever happens to GDP. I think that's the most important kind of message. But for that, we need that economic systems change, because at the moment, because that is also true in our current system, once the GDP starts declining, that also has a real material impact on people's well-being, because people lose jobs, people lose money. So we have to kind of make sure that we have set up the system differently, that we can very much reduce our carbon emissions as fast as we can, and at the same time we can deliver a good life for everyone. So I think really in terms of how to get there, I think it's really telling that different story. It's also about, I think fundamentally, most people don't care about GDP. Most people, probably a lot of politicians, don't really know what it actually is and what it measures, to be completely honest. They just get the newspaper headlines of the economy is doing well, the economy is not doing well, and they're thinking jobs, my pensions, inflation, cost of living, as we're seeing at the moment. So if we build a well-being economy that can solve these, where people have decent and affordable housing, where people, where the cost of living is affordable, where everybody gets the things that they need, nobody is going to care about GDP. So I think in that sense, I will also pass over to Lewis, but I think what really resonated with me was when Louis said, like, really whose well-being matters. And I think in that case, with a well-being economy, everybody's matters, but really the most important one is the people who are not meeting their needs at the moment, especially globally. And there's lots of research that means that materially, we all know we might have to consume less, but that doesn't have to mean our lives are going to be worse if we have more time to spend with our families, if we don't need to worry about money. And I don't think that's a very hard sell, to be honest. I think it's more the kind of, as Lorna said, the stories and the narratives, and which is peddled by the media and by a lot of people, that we all have a lot to lose if we move beyond GDP. It's just not true, I think, and it's really actually hindering us. Like, and we know that GDP is not now doing more harm than good in terms of the environment, in terms of personal and stuff. So I think it's really about how do we get that across and how do we tell that story. But I'll pass over to Lewis now.
Lewis, what are your thoughts to follow on from that then?
Yeah, I mean, fully agree with everything that's been said. First of all, I think we are probably all singing from the same hymn sheet here. It would have been quite nice to have someone who disagreed with us, actually, so we could have more of a debate. But anyway, I mean, I think this comes down to a concept called degrowth for me. And often people hear that and they think, what? Degrowth? But it doesn't mean literally the opposite of growing. It's much more nuanced than that. And it's really about looking at various elements of what development is, societal development, but also realizing that everyone's path is not the same. And in global development circles, we've gone through a period that has involved much reflection on what development really means. What's the essence of why development exists in a global sense? Who are donors? Who are recipients of money? And how they develop? And it's a complicated and difficult thing to address, because it's often linked to the very same structures that neoliberal consensus follows on from in terms of global capitalism and the foundations of modern the basis for the global system we operate in. So ultimately for me, degrowth, when it comes to well-being in an international sense, must come down to this separation of what happens in the global north and what happens in the so-called global south, and that distinction between low-income countries and high-income countries. And ultimately, it's clearly about global northern richer countries in terms of those of us who have those fundamental human needs being met to a degree that is acceptable, accepting that we must put more resources into ensuring those same needs are met elsewhere. And that comes down to a sense of global responsibility. There are models of doing so. You know, you look at the way the EU funded programs across Europe in terms of everybody paying into a pot and everybody receiving. There's some thinking in global development circles around global public investment. This idea that, you know, a rich country like Scotland and a poor country like Malawi should both be paying into the same pot and both be receiving development funding. And a well-being economy is a very good way of achieving such an idea, using that framework. So I think degrowth is key, but also separating how we view ourselves as a rich country and what happens elsewhere in the world that don't have those needs being met to the same degree.
Thank you, Lewis. And just to reflect on that, coming full circle with GDP, there is an element here I would argue against in relation to consumption and what we consume, what we choose to consume, and how much we choose to consume both feeds into the system quite clearly in terms of well-being between the haves and the have-nots, and the expectations that people have against that. So there is a question that comes in there. I did see Lorna, you've got your hand up again.
Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
One thing that we haven't covered, but I actually think is something, again, this is speaking as co-leader of the Scottish Green Party, that we haven't discussed. We talk about the problem of extreme poverty, but we need to talk about the problems of extreme wealth. Mm-hmm. Extreme wealth distorts democracy. It puts powers in the hands of people that aren't elected. And we live in this weird system in the UK particularly, but in most rich countries, where a bunch of people who have a lot more than they need sit around and decide who gets to have enough. What if we sat around and went, everybody gets to have enough, and let's sit around and decide who gets to have more than they need and how much is enough? Should billionaires exist? I absolutely think not. But where's the limit? What's enough? Because extreme wealth is a driver of poverty. They are not wealth creators, they are poverty creators. When you pool that kind of power in one place, you're taking it away from where it's really needed. So I think that's a big part of the conversation. You can't tackle poverty without tackling extreme wealth.
No, and against that point of view then, with regard to poverty, and there's a question that's come up, how central then is the minimum income guarantee to a wellbeing economy? I don't know who'd like to take that one first.
I can say something about that.
Please, Lucas, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer is I think some form of that is like absolutely essential. Like I think one of the key values and principles of the wellbeing economy is that everybody has enough to live in dignity and security. And in some way or another, we need to achieve that. And that will involve some kind of minimum guarantee. And I think we need to have a discussion, or that discussion is already happening, about what form that takes. So there are different models. People talk about universal basic income, which is monetary. Other people prefer something like universal basic services, where you just give housing and other kind of important things like that to people for free. Then other people propose like a job guarantee, where everybody is guaranteed a job if they want one. And I think in reality, probably there's like pros and cons for all of them, but it's probably going to be some kind of mixture of the three. But I think the fundamental principle that everybody needs to have enough I think is really important for well-being economy. I think the interesting one is then picking up Lewis's point, is like, how can we make sure that that happens internationally? Like, these discussions always happen at a national level. So how can we assure that everybody has this kind of a minimum income guarantee globally in the absence of like a global government? I think it's really kind of a really tricky question.
Perhaps that's something just to pick up and reflect on what might be going on in New Zealand at this moment. Is this something that's come up in discussion with yourself over there in New Zealand, and in relation to something you mentioned about increasing childhood poverty that you are experiencing, which we also experience here in Scotland, and what's being addressed through the mindset of a wellbeing economy against that piece of area of work?
Sure. So we haven't had very many discussions about a minimum income guarantee, or that hasn't been a strong feature of our conversations here. But what has happened recently is that we've made a number of increases to the welfare payments, to transfers that that people might need if they're unemployed or at home looking after a child. So those payments were quite low for some time and have been increased quite significantly under the last two terms of the Labor-led and Labor government. So rather than the the basic income, it's more been a focus on getting the welfare state payments to be of a reasonable level, and the minimum wage has just been. They've just announced that the minimum wage will increase again on the 1st of April. So, so our focus has been kind of on that approach in terms of providing for everyone. I'm very much in support of what Lorna was saying about, with that we need a redistributive element to what's going on, and that high wealth is also problematic in the way that high levels of poverty are. That's an area that might need further work. For example, in my jurisdiction, because we don't tax capital at the moment, we don't tax wealth. So and that's obviously that's a political decision about when those things happen. But for example, that's not it's not in place here. And I think that as part of a move to a wellbeing economy, that would be something else that would need to be adopted, that they would need to have that approach where we are addressing the inequality which is growing in New Zealand and in many other countries. So I think that's an important consideration that the Minister has raised there. In terms of child poverty, reducing childhood poverty has been a mission of the Prime Minister. She holds the portfolio herself, and that's been addressed in part by those increased benefits over the last few years, as well as some other measures with respect to housing. So yeah, all of this conversation goes towards that reiteration of wellbeing as a multifaceted consideration, that we need to be thinking about income and consumption, but also health, also the environment. So I think this conversation is kind of hopefully reiterated for people the number of different levels that you might want to be, that we do need to be thinking about if we're actually going to move our economies into that place.
No, the whole wider economic piece is obviously, it's just huge in relation to all this, but there are questions about those countries that have decided to go for a wellbeing economy and those who haven't. And I wonder if we foresee any issues in market compatibility between countries moving towards a wellbeing economy and those choosing to remain, shall we say, more fully capitalist at the time being, and what agreements there might be between those countries that have looked at developing a more wellbeing stance that might not exist or should potentially exist to come and support that sort of more international framework of wellbeing economies. I don't know if anybody would like to pick up on that and think about that compatibility issue then.
I might just comment that I think there is a point that links back to what the Minister was talking about before, that where she was discussing how wellbeing might look different regionally across her country. And I think that's I think that's the case for many of us, that we have different needs and concerns in different areas of our countries, and then that's just exacerbated then when you try to go out there globally, then the issues that we're talking about, particularly, if we're looking at the SDGs and how they apply to all of us, in some cases we are still dealing with access to clean water and, getting and in this world, getting the vaccines, for example, compared to some of the other issues where we've got, we're talking about redistribution, inequality, and other concerns that aren't necessarily as relevant in those cases. So acknowledging the diversity of needs and approaches, I think, is very important. Whilst there is, I'm imagining, help and support in coming together to move towards wellbeing economy, such as we've facilitated through WEGo, through WEAll. Nevertheless, what that actually looks like is going to be different in different countries, and we just have to. I think that's just worth remembering as we go through.
Yep. No, that's. Sorry, I thought my speaker was off then. It's really interesting to hear this debate, because it's sort of gone from the micro to the macro and sort of back down again at various pieces here. And actually, I wonder if I'd be interested to hear from the panel if there are any good examples around the world of policies that are moving away from just failure demand and redistribution measures to pre-distribution and true wellbeing economy policies. And that's quite an open question again, at local, national, international levels.
I was just wondering, maybe for examples, actually, the others might have more, but whether I should briefly explain the terms of the failure demand and pre-distribution. And so that's something, actually, is a failure demand is one of the ideas we've been pushing at WEAll, and we actually published a report about it. And this is the idea that at the moment our economy is doing so much harm to the environment and to people that we are actually paying, the government especially is paying a lot of money to fix these kind of things, like whether that's putting up flood defenses to protect the climate change, whether that is topping up wages to tax credits, whether that is housing homeless people. And so the idea is that these kind of, if we would move to a wellbeing economy, we would basically think about more preventatively, how can we address the root causes so these kind of things don't actually happen in the first place. And one important example of that is, like, we talk about pre-distribution, is the idea that at the moment our economy generates this massive level of inequality, and then we use the tax system to redistribute some of that. And that's obviously really important. Same with the failure demands. It is really important that we do that at the moment, because it does save lives, and it does. But it would be even better if we wouldn't have to do it in the first place. And so the pre-distribution idea is around how could we make sure that the economy does more of the heavy lifting in making sure that that inequality doesn't even arise in the first place, so that you have lower pay ratios in companies, that people get paid a decent wage, so the government has to top it up, and how we can prevent kind of extraction of income from people who are not actually doing a lot of the work. So I will leave it to examples to the other three, and I hope I haven't put you too much on the spot.
Lorna, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, but that's essentially because I don't have any good examples. This is something that is few and far between. I mean, there's a couple of things that I think are really key in this that we are doing work on, which I'll highlight, but that isn't because I think it's enough or sufficiently transformative. I mean, there's basically the fair work agenda, so making sure that jobs pay a living wage, moving away from the sort of precarious work, all the risks that come with that, including poverty, precarity, mental health, physical health problems, inability to get adequate housing because of precarious work. So there's a big thing around making sure that work is fair and the employees are treated properly. That is an example of that. It's something that this government aims to do more of. The other element of, as I highlighted a little bit in my opening speech, but is that the Scottish Greens, and we've embedded it in the Butte House Agreement, and I'm sure you'll see in other bits of government documentation going forward where we've had influence, is about the role of different business models. So I often say that the Scottish Greens are not against business, we are against exploitative and extractive business. Cooperative businesses, social enterprises, community businesses, responsible business, brilliant. You pay your employees a fair wage, you don't damage the environment, you have a nature positive business plan, brilliant. Go crazy, right? But if you're going to be dodging taxes, extracting materials from Scotland, and then not paying your taxes here, so on, exploiting your workers, having them in a precarious position such that the state then has to come in and scoop up the pieces when they can't afford housing or can't afford to feed their kids. I'm not interested in your kind of business. So I think that we can have a lot more and interesting discussion about what cooperatives and social enterprises are. I'm particularly interested in cooperatives. I think there's this idea that cooperatives are sort of small. They don't have to be. They can be big multi-million pound organizations. Anyone who's ever been to Canada will know the success of the Mountain Equipment Co-op. I have several backpacks. No Canadian goes anywhere without a Mountain Equipment Co-op backpack on their back. Cooperatives can be enormous, but they can also help with that sort of entrepreneurship and drive in terms of starting a business on your own is pretty scary, but starting with 10 of your neighbors in your neighborhood, that's much less scary. But it also means that the profits of that business will go locally. They'll go straight into the pockets of people who will spend them. They're not disappearing offshore somewhere. So there's a kind of triangulation between different types of business models. As someone once said, it's about making a living, not making a killing. That not only can reinvigorate our high streets, they can improve our work practices, but all of those kind of business models have a really good track record of contributing to their communities in a positive way and to the environment in a positive way. So let's rethink about what business is for and make those alternative business models as common as profit-making businesses.
Thank you. Lewis, do you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah. I think that idea that business can be good, I think, is a really important starting point, because the majority of our workers, the majority of Scottish people, probably the majority of people on this call work for a private sector organisation, and we've got to recognise that they've got a really massive role to play. That's not what I was going to say. I just agree with Lorna there. I think, when it comes to failure demand and redistribution and pre-distribution policies, I don't have any examples, to be totally honest with you. But I do have an example of policies that I think are really, really important for establishing principles for a well-being economy. And they come down to duties, enforceable duties that put an onus on public bodies, governments, local authorities to think about sustainable development in that holistic sense that I described at the beginning. Mm-hmm. That uses the same definition really as what we all mean when we talk about a well-being economy. And the examples really are sadly quite scant globally. Malta has some really progressive legislation. Finland doesn't have legislation, but it has some coordination mechanisms within its government that work really well to ensure that sustainable development assessments and impact is considered in all those senses of what we mean by well-being, as we've discussed. Canada has bits and pieces at federal level, but whether it works at the local level is debatable. Wales, which we haven't mentioned, has obviously its Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, something that Scotland, as I mentioned, has committed to sort of building upon and doing better since the last election. And our research that I mentioned has really shown that what's fundamental to making that work is defining well-being and sustainable development in legislation. Right now, if you look across the different silos of government, the way in which well-being is interpreted varies quite significantly. And same with sustainable development. And rarely does a duty in sustainable development think about things on that global lens that I talked about at the start. So a very basic level, one thing that Malta has done very well is ensure that those definitions are included in the legislation. And that's something that we would hope that the Scottish version can do. The Wales legislation is weak in terms of its understanding of that global impact. And sadly, it doesn't go beyond what's necessary in terms of holding other departments within the Welsh government accountable to their actions through sustainable development and well-being. It encourages, it sets a good example of the kind of things that can be done, but the Welsh goals, the 7 goals, are laudable and relatively all-encompassing. There isn't an onus on public bodies to be held accountable to that legislation. The Commissioner lacks the teeth to do so. So I think there's some examples of what Scotland can do better. But in terms of the nitty-gritty elements of the mechanisms necessary to really push different areas of the government into action on this, I think we've got very few examples, sadly, globally to learn from. We'll be doing something very new here.
I think just to pick up on that in terms of push. Oh, sorry, Susie, I've just seen your hand up. Do you want to come in?
Just a really quick comment picking up on something Lewis said was, when we're thinking of government, we know that we've got national government and, to Lewis's concerns, international bodies to think about, but also at that local government level, we know how instrumental they can be, particularly with respect to green space and important local living, and that's been touched upon. I just thought it might be of interest to people that the Local Government Act in New Zealand was also amended a few years ago to require local governments to consider social, cultural and environmental well-beings in their work, in their communities. So that's just a different approach to how you can ensure that perspective is embedded at the local government level. So I just offer that as a...
No, and I think that's quite interesting because it sort of leads into where I was going in relation to what Lewis said as well, which is there is something I wonder where we maybe don't debate whether this should land in the hands of government alone. And I reflect upon a situation we've all seen through the pandemic, where people's lives were turned on a head completely in 24 hours. The world changed and various things occurred. And we can probably all remember people talking about they heard the bees, they saw less planes in the sky, there was less traffic around, they went for more walks. We've also had COP in this country, COP26, and we've also had the children striking. Now, I actually wonder, climate striking this, I actually wonder if there's an opportunity now to look at the push that comes from the populace and to ride on that to influence at local government level, who then can influence international government level. And if there's something to be debated or considered around the flip side of actual action from communities and action coming from the populace, that might be a bigger driver towards change than government and or GDP references. Possibly contentious, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
I saw you nod, even though you're muted. You're okay. So I think you're absolutely right that local government is the place to start with that. We have some challenges in Scotland around local government. I think it's worth looking at councils and how local government works in Europe, for example. I alluded to it earlier, but one of the things about Scotland is that our councils are enormous compared to councils in Europe. In Europe, you're much likely to know who your councillors are. They're probably because their ratio of councillors to people that they look after is much, much smaller. The councils are small and they spend much more of your money, a much higher proportion of your money is spent locally. So not only is more money, decision-making about money made locally, but it's more likely to be done by someone who you know, who if they met you in the supermarket, you could look them in the eye and go, you closed my kid's play park. Why did you do that? Which is much more difficult. The Green movement have these 4 pillars, which is the peace, which is the non-violence bit, sustainability, the environmental bit, equality, and radical local democracy. And one of the tough things is to explain to people why the democracy part is important on that. But it's exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, Rachel, that you can't have a well-being economy. You can't have that without the democracy piece, because it's very easy for, say, a government in London to say, well, I'm going to frack under your village in Yorkshire. Much harder to look someone in the eye and say, you know, that someone whose kids go to the same school that your kids go to and go, I'm going to do this thing in your town. If you don't see the people that your decisions affect, you can make decisions that are really not appropriate to them, that they're not going to be happy about. So I think there's worth having a conversation in Scotland. As everyone here will probably know, I support Scottish independence. And as we go into that conversation of discussing what a future Scotland could look like, I think we should have that conversation about what powers are held locally. How much of our tax money is spent locally? How big are those councils? How likely are we to have a really practical say in where our tax money goes and how well it benefits us? Because I think that we are outside the norm. We are outside the European norm. And if we want particularly Scandinavian levels of kind of outcomes in terms of social outcomes, then we need to rethink how our democracy works at that fundamental level.
And I don't know if anybody else wants to come in there. The argument then is, or the question somebody else posed, at what point does the community wealth building approach then tie into that, both in a sort of community focused way, but in a community local government way, as it were, and the ambitions there?
I'm happy to sort of pop back on that into
Yeah,
sort of the
for it,
Scottish context. Community wealth building is something the Scottish government is really interested in. It's not something I can go into great detail on, but like, watch this space. There is some work going on in this space. I think we're all kind of moving into understanding how that works and how that can benefit community, but it is something the government is supportive of.
I wonder, Susie, if you'd like to just come in that in relation to what might be going on in New Zealand there.
I mean, the best example of community wealth building I know is in Preston, closer to you guys than to me. But it is a conversation that we are having here. I'm aware of one local example in north of Wellington, capital city, where that approach is being adopted. And I wouldn't say that it has had whole-scale adoption here yet, but there are definitely examples around the world. Definitely, I would offer the Preston example for you guys to look at. But I think the approach completely ties in. We're talking about, exactly what Lorna was talking about. We're talking about local people creating local jobs, spending money locally, and kind of and building that well-being in a local environment rather than any of the benefits going offshore. So I think it's absolutely an approach to consider from a well-being perspective.
No, thank you very much, Susie. And Lucas, you had a query to come in on?
Yeah, basically on that as well. I think for the way we see the well-being economy is really, I think, a very nice metaphor that Catherine Trebek, one of the founders, likes to use. It's a kind of a picnic blanket approach. So it's about kind of working together across all these different things. Like community wealth building is definitely, as Susie said, is a massive, really, really promising approach and really well aligned with the well-being economy. And the same is for donut economics and degrowth and all these other approaches. I think is really about, so what we're doing at WeAll is really trying to bring all these people working on these different things together to really then kind of form a kind of powerful movement that can then actually kind of implement in these kind of things and exchange and learn from each other and amplify each other's work. So that's really the mission of WeAll. And I think and some of the things that kind of came in my head while we're discussing this, I think which I think is quite important, is that the well-being economy is maybe more about how we go about building it than what it actually looks like in the end, because it will look different in different places. So as we said, it's about participation. It's about strong democracy at the local level and at the national level. It's about having that pre-distribution and preventative mindset, and it's having that different purpose about really embedding a kind of purpose of meeting the needs in the processes that we have, as Lewis said, as Lorna said, with the wellbeing dashboard, with the national performance framework we have in Scotland, as Lewis said, with actually making that compulsory in legislation. And I think if you put these bits, these kind of ways of thinking into place and in the practice, then that the wellbeing economy will follow, and it will look different. It will probably look similar in certain aspects, but also different. And so the upshot of that is that I would very much invite you all to become part of that conversation, because it's not just us. We don't have a blueprint. It's not about us telling you what a wellbeing economy looks like, but it's really about working together to make it happen. And so in Scotland, we got funding to build an allies network, which is basically the idea of organizations in Scotland who are working on economic transformation, economic system change to work together. So if you're interested in that, you can get in touch with me. And WeAll is really doing that on the global level as well, if you're not in Scotland, but somewhere else. so yeah, so this really, I think, for me, a kind of call to get involved, because the wellbeing economy is very much about you influencing that as well, not just us telling you what it looks like.
No, a good point indeed. Lewis, do you want to come back in on that?
Yes, sorry, I did the unspeakable there for a second and did not mute myself. Yeah, building on what Lucas has just said, but also to the question that went into the chat box there around bringing the public with us. And I mean, the question was, where is feeling alienated from new and progressive ideas? And I think it's something that we think about quite a lot. One of our missions as an organization, and I'm talking about my day job here, is to really engage people on global development issues. And we perennially fail at that because we often speak to an echo chamber. And, you know, I think that is something we really need to address. And I think, yes, joining the Wellbeing Economy Alliance network, we have as an organization already, Lucas, I fully support that. But beyond that, we need to be having conversations in spaces that we're not currently having them with people who don't engage with this. And I use an example that the SDGs has managed to do in some locations around the world. I have a good friend who lives in Finland. He is Scottish. He married a Finnish woman. He has a 4-year-old daughter. And I was on a Zoom call, just chatting through things. And I was wearing my SDG badge at the time. Because I'd been on a call, and she knew what the SDGs were as a 4-year-old in Finland. And I said, how the hell is that possible? And it turns out they were on the side of buses. So she knew them because the Finnish government had invested energy in public campaigns to raise awareness in this. And I'm not saying that we need to necessarily raise awareness of the SDGs at this point in time. I think they're important and they're a good framework, but they're also problematic. And we know that. But the principal point here of investing our energy in doing things in new ways and getting the imagery of what this might represent out to new faces is really, really important. And I'm a firm supporter of that.
I nearly did the unspeakable as well then, Lewis. Just possibly coming to the end there, and I see, Laura, you've got your hand up. So if you'd like to just come in on this, but we'll be wrapping up and taking this to conclusion shortly.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know that we need to wrap up. I just was interested by what Lewis said there with the term echo chamber and the question that was in the chat about that. So having brought myself and Patrick Harvey into the Scottish Government, we're now in a position of having 2 radically progressive people in Scottish Government positions as ministers. And speaking in a chamber, literally the chamber of the Scottish Parliament, I am definitely speaking not in an echo chamber. There are people in that chamber who would do regularly brand me an extremist, a dreamer, dangerous. These ideas are dangerous. If any of you have seen some of the less flattering articles about me, particularly in some of the tabloid newspapers, the idea of having a radically progressive woman, particular foreigner minister, is absolutely driving a certain section of the mainstream media and that level totally losing it because they are very threatened by these ideas. So I'm in a really privileged position of being able to bring these exact ideas that we've discussed here, that within the Scottish Greens we discuss all the time and are kind of our bread and butter, out of the echo chamber and into that mainstream space where they are absolutely not welcome. And you know, in some ways, suffering some of the effects of that. But it is an interesting experience of how threatening these ideas are. So I think that there is something about normalizing them, sensible, normal people talking about paying living wages, making sure we don't destroy the environment so we have a planet to live on. I'm not clear how any of that is extremist or dangerous. I think that that's simply common sense. So the more we present these ideas as simply common sense, and the harder it is to paint us as dangerous extremists. So I think we're all part of that conversation, but I think we're very lucky, and I'm very privileged in Scotland to have the platform I have to bring these ideas into that government space, which I wouldn't otherwise have.
No, and I think that's actually a very good point at this moment in time, and very conscious of time for those who signed in to listen. So I think just reflecting on the conversation that's gone on, and just to sum up for everybody here, the recording of this will be available on the Keep Scotland Beautiful website, YouTube channel for everybody, and that will be circulated. I think the key message here is we all need to think about our own echo chambers and stepping out of them. And I think the message here is not scary. It's actually a sensible, coherent argument that we all need to make, and we all need to keep making. So I think as an essence from what's gone on today, our main goal, all of us should take away as an objective from this, is to go and talk to somebody we don't normally talk to about this issue, and to start that spread and that understanding and that acknowledgement of the situation we really are in. There is no second chance here. So I think taking that opportunity, doing what we can as individuals through our organizations, through our power when we vote, through our power, through our voices, to make the change that we want to see for ourselves. So to that end, I would urge anybody who wants to find out about any of the organisations who are talking with us here today, I believe the websites will all be shared. In fact, somebody at this very minute just stuck it in the chat, so we have it there for people to click on. And I would like to say thank you very much for all the panelists who've taken the time out tonight. I fear if this is a recording of saying this, but thank you to the dangerous Lorna Slater, as she badged herself earlier, to Lucas Hart, to Lewis Ryder-Jones, and to Susie Morrissey, who is now going to go for another day, working that day ahead of us at this moment in time. Enjoy your coffee. And to all those at Keep Scotland Beautiful who've pulled this together, and indeed for Scottish Government for supporting and bringing this climate festival to reality. So thank you all. May the storm not blow too hard all night for you who are experiencing it. And I hope to speak and see with you all again soon. Thank you. Good night.